Hi, I'm Dr. Padilla. Here we talk about all things data visualization, and we are continuing our series in Vega-Lite where we are looking at scales. Now we're going to continue on to quantitative scales, which are a hair more complicated than in the previous video. All we've done so far is imported Vega-Lite and imported this data set as well. Some of the key features include the domain and range. The domain is the input values and the range is the type of visual attributes that you'll be applying to it. We have different types of scales that you can use. By default, Vega-Lite applies a linear scale, but you can use log or exponential scales as well. We also have tick marks and grid lines, which you can customize, and we'll talk about clamping and specifying domains as well. Now let's begin with customizing our scales. Here's the plot we made in the previous video. Feel free to pause the video now and copy this over or just watch the previous one. Basically what we have is gender here on the Y and different character types for these Marvel data sets. The only thing I'm going to add just for fun is, of course, my favorite tooltip, and I'm going to add that in as nominal, and I want that to be for the character's name. And all that's done is it allows us to hover over these dots and see which Marvel or DC characters we're referring to here. The character that is male that has the most appearances is Spider-Man Peter Parker. For a gender, it's this character here. And then here's probably the only transgender character, but we need to change our axes to truly see this relationship. So the first thing we're going to do is to set the domain ourselves. By default, Vega-Lite looks at the data values you have and gives you a sensible default. And this is okay. It's hard to look at these lower values. So let's try to look at some different options. So you would take your x-axis and you would add a scale to that. And we're specifying the domain. The domain that we're going to specify is going to go from 0 to, let's say, 6,000. All that has really happened is that it has increased this overall range here. And let's go ahead and make this wider as well. Let's do 600. Okay, so we've changed the overall amount of data that's being plotted. You could do something crazy like that. You can also specify lower values like this. Okay, now notice what happens is if I specify a lower domain value that is much lower than the actual data points, they continue to extend, because with the domain, we are not necessarily specifying the actual data itself. We're just specifying these axes. That's all we're kind of dictating here. But what if we wanted to actually just look at this lower part of the data if we're trying to explore these values here? The way we actually specify that is with a clamp. So we can say for this domain, we can do clamp is true. And now what it is doing is it's literally sectioning off part of the data. Now you have to be very careful because all of a sudden our visualization is less expressive in the sense that it's not showing all the relationships in the data. You want to use this very sparingly, but if you're doing your data analytics process and maybe you want to explore these lower values here, maybe even some of the very low values, it's one way to zoom up on portions of the data. But again, this can very much misconstrue the data if you're using this to convey to people. Something else that's a little confusing that we can change right now is we can change the opacity, and let's just make that a fixed value of 0.6. There's so many values stacked up on each other. It didn't make too much of a difference. Maybe let's make it lower. Okay, so you can see that many dots are stacked up on here, but this does allow us to explore these lower values. For example, if we wanted to know the single transgender character, it's here. If we wanted to look at more of these fluid gender characters, we can scroll over and take a look at those. Again, this isn't something that I would recommend when conveying your data to the public, but this is a method for exploring your data just with scales. A possibly better way to do this than just focusing on the scale is to add a little bit of interactivity for yourself. So you can zoom in and you can pan and you can brush certain sections, which will allow you to explore these without specifying a different domain. If you want to learn more about interactivity, check out the video that is linked in the description. So I'm going to go ahead and take off the scale here. So there's a wide range of other types of scales that you can use. It might help you explore different aspects of the data. In particular, you can add a log scale. So again, we would add a scale and it's very simple. We can specify the type and we would want that to be a log. And that's what this looks like. Log scales are tricky. They can be very challenging for people to interpret, but it does allow you to see some of these values down here that we weren't able to see unless we zoomed up on the data. Now, the last thing I want to cover is that you can customize both your tick marks and grid lines here. The way you would do that is you would specify an axis, and then we would include tick count, and we can set that to however many we want. Let's do 5 in this case. And what that does is it indicates the exact number of tick marks. It's really just a suggestion, so Vega-Lite will do its best to implement this, but sometimes it changes its mind a little bit. And you can dictate what you would like to have happen with the grid marks. So if I specify the grid marks to false, then it removes the line fully. This can be very useful. You can also change the aesthetics of these marks and grid lines by changing the color, width, mark type, etc. The nice part is that this is one of the things you might use to style your chart to make it match some visual aesthetic principles. I hope this was useful in terms of customizing these quantitative scales. We still haven't made a very satisfying visualization, so in the next video, I'll show you the visual analytics process and how I use scales within that process to really try to reveal the true nature of the data. So stay tuned for that, where we're going to cover dynamic scales.